Welcome back to Talking Digital Academy, the audio format for the Digital Academy organized by the Digital History Department at Bielefeld University. My name is Silke Schwand. I am a professor for digital history at Bielefeld, and I am your host for this episode of our podcast. The Digital Academy is an annual online workshop with changing topics from the field of digital humanities. This year, the Academy took place under the topic From Uncertainty to Action, which meant a focus on phenomena of uncertainty in data-driven research. For a deeper dive into these phenomena, we had a special expert panel on our Open Space Day. This day's expert interviews form the basis for the 3 podcast episodes on this channel. This is the 3rd episode, with Professor Susan Schreibman from the University of Maastricht as my guest. Susan Schreibman is Professor for Digital Arts and Culture, sort of expanding the portfolio of disciplines that we are bringing together also here in the Digital Academy. She specializes in the areas of digital humanities, media studies, literary studies, modernism and Irish cultural studies. So here again we have a broad spectrum of research interests. Susan Schreibman is particularly interested in design thinking, creating digital collections and archives, and in publication modalities, which has also been something that I've been talking about with Jane Winters in our first episode of the Digital Academy podcast. Questions like how can we use the digital sphere to also maybe reinvent or at least broaden the perspectives of publication possibilities, and the sort of question of where and how do we actually publish digital work in the future are central to her work. A part of her current work is called the Pure 3D project. So again, a very warm welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation now. So maybe our first question is more of a warming up question. So before we really dive into all the challenges connected with uncertainty and the digital sphere in more general terms. And we've kind of collected with this question the different also areas of expertise that our experts of the Open Space Day have. So I would like to know from you what kinds of data that you actually deal with usually in your research projects. And from the list that I gave everyone just now in the introduction, I think it becomes already clear that it's more probably also a variety of different kinds of data that you interact with. And how or what role does data actually play in your research? Because with the Digital Academy, we address uncertainty and the question how to deal with uncertainty, especially in respect to data-driven or data-oriented research. So maybe that would be the first question or the first complex of questions surrounding the way that you deal with different data in your own research projects.
So that's a very good question. And as you suggested, and I think it's true of many of us in the digital humanities, our research morphs much more than probably if I had stayed a very traditional literary scholar. So I do feel a little bit of an interloper here because my background is not history, although I keep migrating into history. So part of me feels that what I do more is maybe cultural studies.
Mm-hmm.
But the short answer is it depends. So if I take another more recent project of mine called Letters 1916-23, where we created an archive, a digital archive of letters during what's called the Irish Revolutionary period.
Mm-hmm.
So we collected that data, it's letters. It's a crowdsourced project where people transcribe it. How would I interact methodologically? Well, we did make images. That's not so hard nowadays. But we did have to create a platform, and we used 2 different ones so the public could come and participate with us in the project. We needed to create some structures around that data. TI XML was too complex, both for the public and for the amount of data that we were going through. So methodologically, if I think about that project, we had so many different methods, from the creation of the objects to how the creation of the metadata around uploading those letters, to the transcription process, to how we then formatted it for the public to see. And then ultimately we began using it for what we call middle distance research.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not close reading, and it's definitely not big data, because the data set was about, depending on what we did with it, was it the metadata, the full text, et cetera, maybe 6,000 letters.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like dealing with millions of texts. Nevertheless, it's really hard to deal with 4,000 letters. So we started doing data analytics on it, different ones for different algorithms for different purposes, from trying to understand our crowdsourcing community and how they interacted with each other, unbeknownst to them, unbeknownst to us, by looking at how they interact with the system, to two more recent articles I've written with my colleague Monica Bargett, who is a historian, using different algorithmic methods to what we call excavate women's participation in the period, because they're a minority in our data set. So in many ways we wanted to reveal how they participation and how they participated, and how that participation changes from the earlier period in 1916 in the middle of the First World War to the later revolutionary period in Ireland. I don't know if you want me to talk about pure 3D at the moment, or we'll come back to that, but that's phenomenally different data, 3D models, and a phenomenally different reason for dealing with those models, creating what we call 3D digital scholarly editions, which takes a lot from my previous scholarship as a scholarly editor, both in old-fashioned book formats and more in digital collections, digital archives, whichever you want to call them.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also for sort of trying to give us an impression of two very concrete examples that are very, as you said, very, very, very different in the way that you kind of created the data sets, and also, what kind of research projects might actually then later use these kinds of projects. And also for adding something to our discussion of today's Open Space Day that we haven't addressed so much, is the question of community building, and not only community building within the research community, which of course is something that we all do and that we are quite familiar with, but also outside of the research community, because as you mentioned, you decided to go with a crowdsourcing project for the transcription of the letters. Maybe could you just elaborate a little bit more about how that went? And did you have lots of people interacting? Did you personally, or did the research group interact with people from the outside community, or the participants in a direct way, or just via the platform?
Yes to almost everything you asked.
Okay.
I have to say, I feel from lots of conversations I would have at the time and conferences I went to, it was probably one of the more successful crowdsourcing projects. We always had more people wanting to transcribe than we could accommodate. What we learned, especially from that data analysis of the community, was that with one letter, we analyzed one letter, it had maybe 12, 15 pages. 52 people touched it.
That's a lot.
And so what happened was, someone would transcribe a page or pages, someone else would come and read the letter, read the transcript, the image of the transcription, and say, oh, I don't think that word is right. I think it's this word. And make a couple edits. And this would go on, because we also never had enough resources to close the letters, do a final proofing, and make them public in a different way. We always had a very big lag. So yes, we did a lot to get and nourish and keep our community. I was very lucky at the beginning of that project. We had a lot of press in Ireland. We started with 250 letters.
Wow, okay.
And we were on the evening news, on the radio, and within 2 days, none were left to transcribe. And we had that pattern throughout the whole project. But nevertheless, we did a lot. We went out to a lot of public events. If people emailed us, we emailed them back. We had training days, we had drop-in sessions. So I think one of the problems that many projects have is they feel that the project is about, so I use this analogy, I tell from my accent, I'm American, so I use a John F. Kennedy analogy. What I realized was it wasn't the project wasn't about what everybody could do for my project, but what my project could do for others, be they individuals wanting to contribute or other archives that didn't have the resources to make their letters public in the way that we had. So what I realized, I thought of my project as this virtuous circle of collaboration and creativity where people could interact in the way they could or wanted to, which included people giving us, but not that I never kept anything physical, but we made digital copies of family correspondence. Families weren't ready necessarily to give up their letters, but they wanted them part of a public discourse on the period. And I felt that there were individuals who enjoyed more fame or being known in death than they probably had in life. And certain letters, by necessity, I guess, caught the public imagination more than others. But I think our people told us anecdotally their favorite collections were the love letter collections, even though the period's filled with wars and anarchy. But to go back to maybe one of the, and it also has one of your earlier question that has to do with uncertainty and the analytics we did on it. The archive, this project, Letters 1916-23, as you can see, is created, maybe this isn't the right word, eclectically, and could never be complete. No matter what we do, it cannot be complete. Every letter is impossible to find. Many have been destroyed. Even if we could, we had the time and the resource to go to every archive in the world and digitize every letter for this period, it would still not be complete. Families gave us, some families didn't. People as far as South Africa and Australia would email us and say, I have a collection, I have some letters, I want you to be part. So we're always dealing with incompletion and uncertainty. We can only make claims about our data with the data set that we have. It's hard to make transparent what that data set is. Even if we did, we said, we have so many letters from this archive, so many letters from that, so many letters from this individual. It's still difficult for someone else to come along and understand the transparency of that information we may give them. And anyway, it's all available on our site anyway. So in terms of uncertainty, and I listened to a little bit of the previous conversation, it seems to me in the humanities, we're always dealing with uncertain information that is, if you want to call it contested. My part of the 3D project, Pure 3D, is called Contested Narratives, the Battle of Maastricht Bridge. And as literary scholars, as historians, humanities, we're always good, I think. This is what we do for a living, is deal with information that is contested, incomplete. I'm a literary scholar. There are so many ways to read a corpus, to read a novel, to read a poem, depending on your theoretical perspective. There isn't a right interpretation. So for me, this idea of uncertainty, I think, is part and parcel what we do as humanities scholars.
Yeah, thank you very much. I totally agree with that. And I think it's independent of whether you're a literary scholar or a historian, even though those perspectives might differ, but sort of the fact that we are sort of used to dealing with all kinds of uncertainty in the material and also sort of leave room for that uncertainty that is necessary for interpretation, makes us more maybe sensitive to the topic But also, I think that if we turn this to the digital and look at the digital research, then uncertainty is often understood as something different than the kind of ambiguity or vagueness or a sort of room for interpretation that the humanities scholars is used to. So maybe you can also think about, like with my next question, I was going to ask you about the different kinds of uncertainty, and you sort of already picked the one perspective from the humanities. But the question of incomplete data sets, the question of, can I actually pinpoint a location the way that I would expect to be able to do that? Um, Incompleteness is, if we think about the digital sphere and also maybe the interdisciplinary contexts and collaborations that we often are part of in the digital humanities, is that a different kind of uncertainty? Would you say it's a qualitatively different, or is it just a different perspective?
I think for me, it's along a continuum. I think what is very different, and you touched upon this just now, is how do we make transparent or visible um, the primary data, as it were, that we're dealing with. So for books, we have, or articles for print, we have a very good system that's worked for, well, very well for over 100 years. Like the whole
Mhm.
footnoting, referencing, it's become more and more sophisticated with different referencing styles. But a scholar who does good referencing, another scholar can come along and trace back one's thought and one's resources. And one can look at that page or pages in another book and agree or disagree. I think for me, one of the problems with digital research, increasingly now that we're moving into more algorithmic big data, is how is that chain of scholarship conveyed? And that we don't have good models for.
Mhm.
I can make available my whole data set. Okay, that's great. Um, do I also need to make available exactly the algorithms I used and the parameters I chose? So if I'm doing topic modeling, it makes a really big difference if I pick 10 topics or 20.
Mhm.
If I use one topic model algorithm as opposed to another. So do we need the equivalent of, say, lab notebooks
Mhm.
in the humanities for this
Mhm.
research, where I document to the nth degree all the steps I take? I never needed to do that when I was creating more analog scholarship.
Mhm.
Um, is that important? Is it as important as what goes on in the lab if I'm developing some new drug and my results need to be replicated by others as and my lab, because we just can't do it willy-nilly, or else when they make the formulation for the drug, people will die. So what is reasonable within this paradigm that we're working with, and what does transparency look like? Even if I gave you all that, are there other factors that come into play that would make it difficult for you to exactly replicate what I have done?
Mhm.
And how do you, and I heard you talking in the last interview about credit.
Mhm.
Do I get credit for that? I mean, the answer is no now. So if I take all that time and make it available,
Mhm.
is that the equivalent to publishing an article? Or you did talk in the last about we don't really get credit for making data sets and making them available. Um, and so maybe some of the other um, parameters around our work lives need to change to accommodate incentivizing academics to make things like data sets and make them publicly available and provide robust documentation as to how they are created. In this instance, I feel sometimes the library world is ahead of us because they're
Mhm.
good at making available their collections and documenting what's in that collection. What you find, though, often with manuscripts is it's not clear what proportion of those manuscript collections might be available. So it's what we can't see that's as important as what we are working with, what we can see.
Yeah, I think it's a very, and I think we are sort of part of a transformation of scholarship at the moment where these questions become more important in different areas also. We last week we had the big conference of the Association of German Historians, and there were quite a few sessions about the influence of the digital on the way that we do our day-to-day work. And some of the people that were present there also asked questions not only about getting credit for doing data sets, but also who's actually going to teach me how to do that? Where's the standard? Where's the place where we actually define those standards? And how do we report back, or sort of how do we translate that into the field of history? Because I think sort of in the digital humanities or in sort of research data collectives or sort of communities, these standards are being made and they're there, like FAIR and all these different sort of data set standards. But the question would be, how do we tackle the uncertainty, and that's a very different kind of uncertainty, of our fellow researchers in the humanities fields? How, who's going to teach them what to do? And is it necessary for every historian to learn how to do a data set?
Yeah, I would say yes.
Okay.
Yeah. If I get a vote, I think now, and I say this in my university all the time, we do a disservice to our students in all the fields that they're in by not teaching them robust digital methods. Whether they're going to become historians or go into the workforce, these are now part and parcel, the questions that you're asking, part and parcel of our lives. Whether we're going to become academics or work, people are always going to be interacting more and more with data sets. They need to know the questions, at least know the questions to ask of the information that they're receiving, whether it's for personal use or for work use. So I would say yes. Does everyone have to become a digital humanist, every historian? I think at some level the answer is yes as well, but it is certainly a spectrum. There is no historian now, I suspect, who does not use digital tools. It's impossible. I can't imagine anyone working on a PhD or new in the field who doesn't use data sets, doesn't use all the panoply of digital information we have. Should the line be that strict between consumers and producers? Maybe not, because if I understand how this information, these data sets, these archives, etc., are created, I would also be a better consumer of them.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we should also invest more in what you just said in teaching our students from very early on about the world that they live in, and that world is basically on I think qualitatively different level influenced by data sets and data in general as it was before. So I think that is something that is true for almost any student at any university, independent of their subjects, that they should actually learn about that. Maybe I can come back on the notion of uncertainty to the crowdsourcing project, because we've been talking about data set creation or sort of context of creation. And of course, and you said your background is in digital scholarly editing, so you're very familiar with how to, almost maybe sort of use standards or contribute to standards. How did you deal with as I imagine from the outside, a different kind of uncertainty, or did crowdsourcing actually add uncertainty to your data sets? You said that they were discussing single words or readings or transcriptions in the letters. Or would you say that, and did it contribute in a positive way or rather in a uncertain way?
So they didn't actually discuss, but when we analyzed it, because we didn't have a space for discussion, simply because of the tools we were using, the software we use. But when we analyzed that, we did see, on any given page, maybe 15 people
Mm-hmm.
making edits. So
Mm-hmm.
in a way, they collaborated together, but they didn't know
Mm-hmm.
it because you could just come and so I would say, without any doubt, the community contributed to less uncertainty because by the time one of our staff did the final proofing, they were by and large perfectly transcribed. And if there was a word that people had difficulty with, we often had difficulty as well. So in our case, they turned all these images from images to machine readable text that then they could also, as a community, benefit from, because then they could search the collection and enjoy it and read it, and scholars could also use it. And then we also began to do some data analytics on the collection itself. So no, in that case, I would say my experience, I cannot say anything more positive about my experience. It was the most fun project I think I have ever worked on. It was great working with people who were interested, with students. We did a lot of work in schools. And so in a minute, I'm going to try to revive it a bit. Since I moved to the Netherlands, it's been hard to keep going. But it was a fabulous model.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I did choose a time period that would be of a lot of interest. It wasn't a coincidence. I started in 2013 for this event in 2016
Mm-hmm.
that I knew would be a big event in Ireland.
Thank you. And also, I really enjoy listening to you talking about that project. I think it's a very, maybe even a best practice project, how to integrate different groups and, assure participation in dataset creation. That was something that we also talked about. How do you address the fact that datasets are always created and that the creators sort of have control or maybe follow certain hierarchies, certain ideas of the world. And maybe projects such as yours can actually help us understand the value of participation and also shared creation or shared tasks of creation. What would be your take on that? Is that a possibility to sort of make it more accessible and also more participatory in general to have that kind of projects for bigger data set creation?
I mean, absolutely. I don't see why not. It does take a lot of effort and the right kind of people to work with the community. They're not always the people we have on our digital humanities projects, but I also view a project like this very politically. So in many places in the world, humanities courses, humanities departments are being defunded and closed.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I view these kinds of projects politically, that most people, when they hear that another uh, program, another English department, another language program, another classics is being closed, they don't really care. If the university was going to close the business school, they would care, and business would care. But in a way, I feel as academics in the humanities, we have done ourselves a disservice. We have not made it important for the public because we don't reach out to them enough with our scholarship. Of course, there are many people who ultimately write, say, books like biographies or popular histories for the public, but we don't engage them in our research, not in the way the sciences has done for a very long time. There's a reason it's called citizen science.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I felt it was also political that we need to bring people into our research so when we're being defunded or less funded, people feel the public feels that it's not a good thing for us and for our society.
Mm-hmm. And would you agree, maybe just to sort of stay a little while on that political argument, which I think that was very well made? Would you say that, especially for the digital society or society under the digital condition, whatever that is, the need for humanists or humanities scholars to interact more with the society and show them what our relevance and value can be in the evaluation of information, for example. We're talking a lot about source criticism and the question of where does the data come from, who made what and why. Would you say that we should step more into that particular realm to sort of address also that question of relevance and show people that we have something to tell them about how to deal with data sets, data collections, and the digital?
I think, yes, absolutely. And I think it starts with how we educate the next generations. So it goes back to that question you asked me earlier about the spectrum of people working with digital tools and should they all be making data sets. And at some level, I think these are really life skills that people do need to have. And so, yes, are we in a good position to do that? Absolutely. Are we used to dealing with uncertainty, with serendipity, with collision? Of course, this is what we deal with all the time. And so I think we are in a very good position. Should this be as ubiquitous as, like in the States, you would have kind of writing 101 or math 101. Everyone had to do math and be able to write. Should everyone be able to deal with data nowadays? Yeah, I think, of course, the answer is yes.
Thank you so much. I think our half hour is almost over already. But maybe you can allow me like one question to sort of build the bridge to the discussion and come back to the pure 3D project, because now we've talked a lot about the letters, and I think this is a project that kind of feels familiar, although I've never done something like that. But, being used to working with texts, sort of tackling questions and challenges in transcription processes, that kind of feels more familiar. But what will you say are the specificities of dealing with uncertainty in the 3D project that you have? After that, we can open the discussion for more questions.
Maybe a theme through my scholarship is scholarly editing. And I worked with a colleague, Kostas Papadopoulos. We worked together in Ireland, and then we're both here in Maastricht. And he's a Neolithic archaeologist. Couldn't be any more different than me. I'm a literary modernist, and I do poetic modernism. So they're so apart, but he worked with 3D, and he was always saying, we have problems with 3D. I think there was some conversation with that before. Research groups creating 3D models, using them, and then writing two-dimensional articles, text articles, and maybe putting an image. And all the scholarship that went into the 3D model is lost because it doesn't fit into this two-dimensional plane that we have. Even though most of our journals are electronic, the systems that exist don't allow or provide for, say, an iframe or an integration of a model. And even if you put the model there, there's such challenges in keeping them online. So this idea of creating a framework, which is what Pure 3D is, for what we're calling digital scholarly editions, came about. So melding some of the precepts and scholarship that we have from, say, scholarly editing and textual scholarly editing, thinking of the text of the edition as the 3D model. So the model becomes the text. Now the analogies are not perfect, because then who's the author? But the idea of the 3D model as the text, surrounded by apparatus, by annotation, multimodal annotation, is something that we're working through. Of course, with 3D, you have different affordances for uncertainty. And these go back to, for example, physical, traditional fields like archaeology, architecture, let's say you have an ancient building that you are reconstructing. Archaeologists take a particular view. I can reconstruct it so it looks, quote unquote, like the original, or how I think the original looked. Or I can reconstruct it, which is more recent and more common now. I can show you the reconstructed parts that look visibly different, so you realize what's original and what's reconstructed. But you can't do both in the physical world. But you can in the 3D world, in the digital world. In fact, you could have multiple reconstructions. You could have what I think it looked like, what I think it looked like plan B. I could make it pristine, so it looks beautiful. And I could show you the reconstructed aspects of it. And it's very easy to do that with a click of the mouse. So in some way, uncertainty can live much more comfortably alongside what looks like more certain hypotheses in things like reconstruction. I have a different example from my own project on Maastricht Bridge, but I'll stop there.
But thank you so much for the insight that you provided and your answers to my questions, and especially for giving us insight in those very, very different projects. Adding to that impression that digital scholars are actually jack of all trades, at least in some respect, that we kind of explore and excavate. I like the excavation metaphor as well. I usually talk about exploration, but excavation is also, I think, a very interesting take on what we actually do. So thank you very much.
And thank you for the invitation, and I hope to see more wonderful things coming out of your community.